My name is Denise Göktürk, and as the chair of the Department of German here at UC Berkeley, I would like to welcome you all to this year's Mosse-Lecture. Thank you for coming out on this rainy 1st of March. It just cleared up in time. Our topic is democracy. Democracy has been under duress in recent years. Around the world, we have seen a rise of emboldened authoritarian leaders feeding on nationalist populisms and a decline in civil liberties and civic engagement. Let me just start with a quote from Turkey's President Erdogan, who had declared already 22 years ago, at the time when he was still mayor of the city of Istanbul, he said, "For us, democracy can never be a goal, only a vehicle. Democracy is a streetcar. We get off once we reach our destination." So it certainly feels like many people have been getting off the train at different destinations. And we are all asking ourselves, what does democracy, the rule of the people, mean today? And who are the people? Who is talking with whom? How, when, where? What are the spaces of interaction? To help us wrestle with these pressing questions, we are delighted to have with us today one of the most analytical minds to have written on democracy and populism, Jan-Werner Müller, who is a professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Some of us already had an opportunity to meet with him in a lively conversation over lunch in the Department of German. And we are delighted about his visit to Berkeley and his openness and generosity in meeting with graduate students and colleagues. Jan-Werner Müller's work grows out of a German tradition of thinking critically about the formation of the public sphere, constitutional patriotism, and memory wars since the end of the Cold War on the European scale. Professor Müller is the author of 6 books: Another Country, German Intellectuals, Unification and National Identity in 2000, A Dangerous Mind, Carl Schmitt in Post-War European Thought, 2003, Constitutional Patriotism, 2007, Contesting Democracy, Political Ideas in 20th Century Europe, 2011, Wo Europa endet, The End of Europe, 2013, and Was ist Populismus, published in German in 2016 and then translated into 24 languages, including Hungarian, Turkish, and Chinese. 2 further books are forthcoming: Christian Democracy, A New Intellectual History, from Harvard University Press, and Furcht und Freiheit, ein anderer Liberalismus, from Surkamp. He also published several edited volumes, one on memory and power in post-war Europe, and many, many articles. It's also important to mention that Jan-Werner Müller is not just a highly productive academic, but also a public intellectual who regularly intervenes in current debates, publishing articles in Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Die Zeit, The Guardian, London Review of Books, New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, and various other platforms. In our conversation earlier today, he seemed to be encouraging us, I think, to apply our critical minds to more such civic engagement. In an email exchange in preparation of this event, after reading one of Jan-Werner Müller's essays, I had asked him, "So resistance is futile then?" And he emailed right back saying resistance, protest are absolutely not futile, but it's important to think about the structural problems, constraints that they face today. And we tried to capture that in the event poster designed by Molly Kruger, one of our graduate students. And so thinking about the constraints, also the structural, architectural constraints that protest faces. So let me say a few words before I clear the stage about the Mosse-Lectures. The Mosse-Lectures at Humboldt University in Berlin are a prominent public humanities event. They present 2 series per year there, and you can actually watch the recordings of all the previous lectures on their website, Mosse-Lectures. The topic of the fall 2016 series was populism, and Professor Müller gave a lecture in that context in November 2016. So this was before the election of our current president. Other series were devoted to topics such as liberalism or Europe in the eyes of others, of its others. The name Mosse evokes multiple resonances. A first association for many of you might be the famous historian George Mosse, an emigre from Nazi Germany who taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. In Berlin, however, the associations with the name Mosse resonate much further back to Rudolf Mosse, for instance, the media mogul of the Weimar Republic and inventor of modern advertising. The Mosse family was a Jewish-German family of great significance for the economy, cultural life, urban architecture, and the arts in Imperial Germany and the Weimar Republic. Roger Strauch from the Mosse Foundation has been generously supporting these lectures, both in Berlin and Berkeley, strengthening our existing ties with the Humboldt University in Berlin. I think Roger was intending to be here today, but he also had a conflicting engagement at the Berkeley rep, which he is also supporting. So in any case, warm thanks to him. Martin J., who will be responding to Jan-Werner Müller, hardly needs an introduction here at Berkeley with his groundbreaking work on European history and the Frankfurt School, as well as the history of visual media. I cannot imagine a better suited respondent. Thank you very much, Marty, for generously agreeing once again to act as discussant. So Jan-Werner Müller's lecture today is titled, Can Architecture Be Democratic? And I'm really looking forward to hearing how the political scientist will bring democratic theory to the urban ground and reflect on performances and interactions in city spaces. I believe we have some people from architecture, environmental design, and global urban humanities, but also many other programs, critical theory, here in the audience. So I expect that the lecture and the response will generate a lively discussion on questions of scale, perspective, and possibilities of intervention in our challenging times. Please join me in warmly welcoming Jan-Werner Müller to Berkeley.
Fortunately, I'm not a political scientist, only a theorist. If I were a social scientist, I would have been deeply offended by being called a public intellectual, because that's the kiss of death in the eyes of many of my colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be able to give the Mosse lecture here tonight. It's also a great honor to have Martin J. as a respondent. like pretty much everybody in this room, I assume. I've been reading him for many, many years. Never had the pleasure of meeting him in person, so I'm grateful that you took the time to engage with my thoughts here tonight. And last not least, I'm thankful to have learned that whatever you say about the resistance on email can become public at any moment. Can architecture be democratic? The question isn't terribly often asked, even though a related question, is architecture political, tends to elicit a sort of almost immediate yes by many observers more or less specialized in the matter. Most observers would say that yes, architecture is political because on one level it always imposes, it in a certain way constrains, in a certain way coerces, at the same time also enables. In the widest sense, it is bound up with dynamics of association and dissociation. And you don't have to be a follower of Carl Schmitt to think that these dynamics of association and dissociation are always at the heart of politics. Moreover, plenty of authorities have pronounced on this wider question of architecture as always being political. The most successful real estate developer ever to have been elected president of this country observed design activity and political thought are indivisible. Thomas Jefferson. Moreover, plenty of architects themselves, both in the past and still in the present, have engaged in some form of democracy talk. Louis Sullivan, for instance, one of the pioneers, as many of you know, of the high-rise on this side of the Atlantic, author of a book called The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered, and probably best remembered today for having coined the phrase form follows function. He opined at one point, I'm quoting, "A certain function, aspirant democracy, is seeking a certain form of expression, democratic architecture, and will surely find it." Frank Lloyd Wright, who I think never had a problem with coming up with grand-sounding statements, actually applied to the National Planning Resources Board in 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, with a project which was intended to, as he put it, continue the search for democratic form in architecture as the basis for a, now comes the surprising bit, a true capitalist society. And people who signed that application, who were on board with Frank Lloyd Wright's project, happened to be people like John Dewey, Albert Einstein, and Georgia O'Keeffe. Plenty of architects today, as you all know, sort of tend to deliver their buildings with a nice-sounding narrative that may well revolve around democratic-sounding values. And I think it's become very rare to have characters like, probably most infamously, Le Corbusier, saying things like, having a competition is a sign of democratic cowardice. People wouldn't say this, I think, quite so openly and direct now. Moreover, plenty of actual buildings, at one point or another, have been dubbed democratic. Some more obvious ones, like the Lincoln Memorial, which has often been described as a temple of democracy. Less obvious ones, like the Villa Savoy, or for that matter, the Seattle Public Library. Now, to try to think about this question a little bit more systematically, I thought that in a very simple, some of you might say, simplistic way, I want to divide up the question of democracy, speaking of Lincoln, into a matter of by the people, for the people, and of the people. And maybe disappointingly for some of you, at least for the moment, I want to set aside the chapter about by the people, which is to say, a consideration of, in the widest sense, planning processes where one might reasonably say citizens should be involved. It's obviously an important topic. It obviously relates to some of the most burning issues of our day, to do with gentrification, for instance, and the right to the city. It's also a fiendishly difficult subject from the point of view of democratic theory. So I want to set that aside for now, but I'm happy to engage in conversation about it later on if you wish. And instead, focus on the two remaining aspects. Democracy for the people and democracy somehow of the people. Okay, what is democracy for the people? Well, if you think about the great modern democratic revolutions in France and in the US, one of the striking things is that the revolutionaries almost immediately engage in a kind of pedagogical project relating to democratic values, where they essentially use the built environment as a kind of staging ground to, however you want to put it, inculcate or remind people of particular democratic ideals or maybe particular democratic exemplars before they even start to reshape the built environment in any particular way. So, as you all remember, for instance in France, it becomes very popular to put up busts of Cicero, Cato, various other, if you like, heroes of democracy or maybe just republicanism for that matter. Less well known is that at the time there are also ideas around to basically fill the National Assembly with sculptures of bound aristocrats, basically symbolizing the overcoming of the aristocracy, all done in a very sculptural, for those of you who care about these sorts of distinctions, in a certain way, very Hegelian way, not really architectural at this point at all. But it's one of the main immediate developments, and it comes out particularly in, again, many of you will remember this, the festivals which revolutionaries stage specifically to inculcate certain ideas and also to basically make citizens develop a certain kind of democratic sociability. So well-known examples are, for instance, what happens in the Festival of Unity and Indivisibility, where it's actually a statue of Isis that is put in the place where the Bastille used to stand, and where they literally bring in deputies from all over France to drink milk from her as a sign of symbolic commitment to the new democracy. And then people, go to the Champ de Mars and dance and commit to democracy in some way or another. Marianne is the obvious other example of trying to somehow, in a more sculptural way or pictorial way, kind of inculcating democratic values. Except this doesn't seem to work particularly well. As many later historians have pointed out, people are essentially turned into more or less passive spectators in these large, emptied out spaces. They're confused about the symbolism. They're not entirely sure what's what and what is exactly supposed to symbolize what. They also have to come to terms with the fact that the symbols sometimes change quite rapidly as the revolutionaries get increasingly under attack, both from the inside and from the outside. Typically, Marianne is replaced by Hercules as both a sign of the people and obviously as a sign of strength against the enemies of the revolution. But by and large, many people consider this kind of pedagogical project to have been a failure. So what might then be an alternative or a different kind of strategy? Well, here it gets more architectural in a certain way, away from just sculptures and towards forms and also particular materials as possibly being important in reinforcing democratic commitments. And reinforcing them in a particular way that is supposed to glorify democracy as a political system and as a set of ideals. Axel Schultes, the well-known architect, co-architect of the Chancellery in Berlin today, at one point observed, quoting Wittgenstein, "Architecture coerces and it glorifies. Where there is nothing to glorify, there can be no architecture." And in a famous and influential Supreme Court decision, which basically ensured that for the first time people could have demonstrations very close to Congress, the court rejected, but at the same time at least also mentioned as a possibility, the idea, I'm quoting from that 1972 decision, the glorification of a form of government through visual enhancement of its public buildings. It was actually the DC court, sorry, not the Supreme Court, that brought up this idea. So the shift to an idea of glorification of architecture in the built environment as somehow involving directly also the glorification of a particular political system. Well, what does that mean concretely? Well, again, probably relatively well-known ideas. The notion that when you look closely, Washington, D.C. is actually Versailles. As Louis Mumford and many other people pointed out, that's basically the underlying structure that you get. Very much in contrast, by the way, with ideas which other people had. Jefferson, of course, wanted a what he called federal town, small and very much in line with his small r Republican/agrarian ideals, and a complete break with this quasi-royalist glorification. Nevertheless, the idea was there and the idea persisted. Louis Costa, for instance, the urban planner of Brasilia in the 1950s and 60s, also said, we are building a Versailles for the people. And with very similar ideas, by the way, about the division of powers becoming structurally visible through a particular kind of urban design. Okay, the problem with this alternative strategy, I think in the eyes of many critics and observers, has been that sometimes, at least, the links between particular forms, or even for that matter, particular materials, and then this notion of a glorification of democratic values seems somewhat arbitrary and in some places positively indecipherable or incomprehensible. Sometimes it's just a matter of not having the requisite knowledge to decipher what might be going on. Let me give you, if I may, another well-known example. You'll recognize this, of course, as the evolution of what at one point was called the Freedom Tower, but of course nowadays is simply World Trade Center number 1. Those in the know perhaps would be able to say that banal spire on top of a very, if I may say so, banal corporate building was actually initially the Statue of Liberty. It was actually the arm upholding the torch which Libeskind wanted to put on the building, but which then, well, gradually changed over time, officially because of security concerns, and eventually ended up as the central kind of spire. Or the fact that Libeskind initially said this tower is going to be exactly 1,776 feet high, well, you kind of have to know that it is, and perhaps in some cases you also have to know what it means. Or think of certain materials. Norman Foster's famous glass dome, often celebrated as a successful piece of democratic architecture in the New Germany. Why? Well, very much in line with general post-war ideals of saying that glass is obviously the material for democracy because it signals transparency, accountability, what some critics then later on actually termed a typical post-war West German transparency ideology, or to be less polite about it, a particular kind of transparency kitsch, has persisted into the life of the so-called Berlin Republic. But on closer inspection, it's not so obvious that you can tell a simple ideological story from a shift of the, as the Nazis always put it, Wort aus Stein to the democratic Wort aus Glas. For while this might be attractive in certain ways, one of the most well-known, perhaps one of the best, if that's not an inappropriate expression, fascist buildings, Giuseppe Terrani's in Como, of course also celebrated glass. And even worse for the advocates of transparency ideology, he explicitly said, I'm quoting, fascism is a house of glass into which everyone should be able to look. And there was a very specific story even about basically the openness of the building to the outside, the immediate connection with the outside square, and by implication with the outside people. And for those of you who care about these details, this was also one of the first buildings in Europe which featured an automatic, that's the building today, an automatic glass door, which had been invented in the United States in 1934 and was incorporated here. In a certain way, you might say even more to drive home the idea of openness. You just have to show up, and the building magically opens right for you. And as has often been pointed out by critics in Berlin, yes, it's a nice thing that citizens can go up to the roof of the Reichstag and look down, literally look down, on their deputies, symbolically, if you like these sorts of stories, reaffirm that they are the sovereign on top of their representatives. But of course, there is no actual interaction. And even more interesting, the space itself cannot really be individually be appropriated. There are other buildings where people, if you like, can be literally on top. Maybe one of the most well-known examples of our time is the Oslo Opera House, where many people have seen it as a particular success, that anybody can go up there, can cycle up there, can jog up there, can ski up there, can do all kinds of things up there. You can't do that sort of stuff, on top of the Reichstag. You can basically just be a tourist of one sort or another. So where to go from here? We seem to be somewhat stuck. We seem to perhaps be stuck, in particular, with the notion that some theorists have pushed very much, that actually democracy is always going to suffer from a sort of inherent iconographic deficit, that more narrowly the people can never really be represented, but that also so the underlying ideals cannot really be represented in architecture in some way or through other means. And that this whole idea of representing democracy for or before the people is a dead end. And I agree that it is. So we have to restart and look somewhere else. And my suggestion is to go back to basics for a second. What is democracy anyway? Don't worry, I'm not going to launch into a three-hour discourse about its true nature. But what I want to emphasize is that it is, of course, at the most basic level of all, a system that involves a mechanism for making binding collective decisions that prima facie is supposed to involve all citizens in one way or another. And it's supposed to do that in such a way that democracy becomes an ongoing process where these collectively binding decisions are never foreseeable and can always be revised. So they're never foreseeable because, again, on a very banal level, we never really can know what certain election outcomes will be. If you want absolute certainty, go to North Korea. There the outcomes are going to be clear. And at the same time, even though we have, at certain intervals, collectively binding decisions, democracy is also, as my colleague Nadia Obinati once put it, a politics of second thoughts, where every decision can be looked at again under certain conditions. So far, so maybe blindingly obvious. But what might be the implications of these blindingly obvious basic points for the built environment? Well, I think the basic implication is that you need both a locus of centralized decision-making and you need something around it that allows for that continuous process of revising and revisiting and perhaps resisting sometimes. So far, so obvious. But once I think one grasps that essentially dual nature of democracy, one can perhaps see how it's always been there from the very beginning, and that at least in this regard, the otherwise obviously extremely important difference between ancient and modern democracy, modern representative democracy, isn't actually maybe all that important. For how did look things already at the very beginning? Well, they look pretty much like this. Yes, it's Emmanuel Macron giving a speech in Athens not too long ago, but of course, being a hugely talented politician as far as symbolism is concerned, he chose the ancient Pnyx, which is to say, the actual site of the ecclesia where the Greek assembly met. And as you all know, the place where the Greek assembly met was pretty much exactly like this structure, where a speaker, well, not at night obviously, but a speaker would stand in front, always facing the sun, so always in the full glare of the sun. Everything had to be fully visible, and where basically everybody in raked seats sat around the speaker, with also everybody being able to see everybody else. So what sometimes has been called full intervisibility, so that you not only fully see the speaker, you also see everybody else's reaction to the speaker at exactly the same time. As you know, that particular site, about 10 minutes walk further northeast, was complemented by the agora, i.e. mostly a marketplace, but essentially what nowadays we might simply call mixed use. So not just economic use, but religious uses, sometimes also political uses. This was the site where ostracism happened. That did not happen actually in the civic assembly, and also the place where certain more specialized political functions took place. So the agora was also the site of the so-called Old Proletarium, the council house where basically the agenda for the assembly was prepared. As far as I can make it out, nobody can be 100% sure how exactly it looked like, but plenty of archaeologists seem pretty sure that, if anything, it came also closest to a certain ideal of full intervisibility, so that everybody in the council house could see everybody else, and possibly there may have been windows so that people on the outside could look in and occasionally also listen in. Obviously, one of the advantages in this grand scheme of democracy of the agora was that it was a relatively uncontrolled space, that people could bump into all kinds of other citizens, but of course also non-citizens, metics. It was an unforeseeable place. You didn't know what you heard, what kind of issues you might come across, but in a sense you could experience the demos in at least a significant degree of diversity. And interestingly, given the kind of debates we tend to have today, one of the not so obvious exclusions of ancient Athens, with obviously women and slaves being the obvious ones, and ethnic exclusions being the obvious ones, one of the not so obvious exclusions was the fact that anybody who lived too far away from the assembly could basically not really participate. So there was, in a sense, a city-rural divide at that point. Some historians have estimated that about 40% of Athenians lived at least 15 miles from the place, so basically couldn't really participate because you couldn't just come in and vote and speak and so on and so forth. I mean, just a side remark. Rome, of course, to a certain degree replicates that structure with interesting differences. Those of you who are interested in sort of these kinds of tidbits, Carl Schmitt, for once, thought it was extremely interesting that in Greek democracy, citizens sat, whereas in the Roman Republic they stood. He has an interesting diary entry where he says, if people stand, that is a republic. People sitting, that's democracy. And it's true that actually some of the relevant actors had explanations for why this was the case. The Romans actually thought, as implausible as it might sound to us, right now, right here, that sitting down made people rash and impetuous. So it was actually not the standing crowd that one had to worry about. One had to worry about the sitting crowd. Anyway, be that as it may, if one does what, of course, one isn't supposed to do as any kind of credible historian, namely fast forward by hundreds and hundreds of years, and basically say, okay, so what does that dual nature of democracy look like today? I think the answer is relatively straightforward. At a certain point, of course, we get specialized housing for that centralized locus of decision-making, and that's what nowadays we simply call parliaments. And that's not quite as trivial as an observation as perhaps it might initially sound, because, again, it was, of course, Schmitt who said, well, parliaments are, as the name allegedly already makes clear, just endless sort of places for talking and never deciding anything. And from a democratic theory point of view, that's, of course, fundamentally wrong. They are actually places of decision-making. They are places which, ideally, basically managed to get across the fact that democracy is a very delicate balance between conflict and cooperation at the same time, that it has to have space both for deliberation but also for dramaturgy and actually making disagreements visible under certain conditions. So it's maybe also worth remembering in this context Winston Churchill's famous speech in the 40s when he talks about how should we rebuild the House of Commons, and where he says parliaments need a sense of crowds and urgency. This is why he was in favor of basically keeping the House of Commons too small and people constantly bumping into each other and jostling and so on. And he ended up, as you probably all remember, ended up saying this is exactly the right system, and this particular way of dramatizing conflict through opposition explains allegedly everything about the success of British democracy. I don't want to explore that particular question, but ever since, of course, people have given a lot of thought of how exactly within this central locus of decision-making make the democratic values basically come alive through particular kinds of spaces. Now, what about the people? Well, obviously the people cannot be brought into that central site of decision-making, even though, as a footnote, it might be interesting to note that Robespierre at one point said we should have the largest galleries possible. And he said we should have galleries that should seat 12,000 people. That's going to be as close as we could ever come to kind of making the people immediately visible in the site of decision-making itself. But of course that didn't really happen. What happened instead, and this is an often told story, is the fact that the place of centralized decision-making is complemented by the emergence of the public sphere and the press in particular. And 19th century Democrats, well, you may not say that he really was a Democrat, but never mind, people like John Stuart Mill explicitly said, thank God that we nowadays have our own PNICs and we have what the ancients had by way of an agora through the press and through that more abstract public sphere. So the point that I think is worth driving home is that democracy always needs these two elements. The formal element of centralized decision-making and the informal on the outside. Only one of them has a democratic form, but the informal still has a democratic meaning and cannot simply be dismissed by the fact that relevant actors, be they in the press, be they in the widest sense in the public sphere, be they out on the squares or on the streets, basically do things that are important and indispensable in the larger scheme of democracy. If you think of particular images that have sometimes been used to get that intuition across, think, for instance, of the image that Jürgen Habermas used in Between Facts and Norms, where he says this informal world basically lays siege to the formal world of the administrative/parliamentary apparatus. I mean, image is a bit curious in the sense that, of course, the siege is not meant to succeed. We're not meant to conquer and actually defeat that other element. It's more about they both have to be there, and the pressure that comes from the outside is prima facie legitimate and indispensable. And that sort of intuition perhaps can also sometimes be captured in these more sculptural, if you like, forms. So two of the much less well-known characteristics or features of the new, allegedly fully democratic architecture in Berlin today can be found in the Paul-Löbe House, which is basically largely an administrative building to the north of the Reichstag, but where basically the whole ground floor is a kind of street, and at least symbolically brings the street in from the outside into the parliamentary building. I'm not sure this was intended, because as some of you who may have seen it may also remember that actually what is then on the street are two quotations, one from Thomas Mann and one from Ricarda Huch. So, if it had been our end, it would have been more obvious, but, maybe I'm reading too much into it. But even the parliamentary chamber itself, I think actually does one thing very well. If you've seen it, you remember that actually the galleries kind of jut into the space. They're not sort of sidelined in the way they're sidelined in the House of Commons and in the House of Representatives. There's a kind of dynamic use of space as if the people are rushing in. And of course the people are not rushing in, but the suggestion that there is that kind of pressure on us
I think is a good thing to try to convey. By the same token, it is, of course, in a sense, a genuine failure that Schultes never completed the project, and that what was supposed to have been in front of the Chancellery, namely the so-called Civic Forum, has never been built, and is nowadays basically a wasteland between more or less administrative buildings. And the idea, which was there at the beginning, to say this is going to be exactly that space for people to appear, to demonstrate, to make themselves heard, was basically left out of the entire picture. Now, one thing you might say in this context, if you think this is far too traditional and far too conventional, might be to say that actually what might be wrong with this image is that the decision makers nowadays, for the most part, really aren't in the same place. Because if you think especially about the European Union, the elites are constantly circulating from summit to summit. And if anything, it's about kind of following them around and not even knowing where they are and who has access to whom, as opposed to an almost sort of still quasi-royal image of saying here is the central locus of power. Although, as you also remember, of course, kings were also circulating for a long time and basically going from town to town. Just a thought for your consideration, maybe for later on. What I want to do for now is basically just take a closer look at this idea of an important role for public space in particular in doing justice to that second element of a dual conception of democracy. And in particular, talk about a few politically important elements of what public space can do, and then, time permitting, also say a few words about the extent to which these particular functions can or cannot be replicated online. So first, very obviously, in 2011, Barney Frank, when asked about Occupy Wall Street, went on record and said, "I do not understand why people think that simply being in a physical place does much." Well, one possible answer to that observation is that a lot of people being simultaneously in a particular physical space might actually do a lot. Civil rights leaders in the 1960s very often explicitly invoked what they called the sheer significance of our numbers. And if you think back to the early weeks of 2017, you might say, well, yeah, for many people size really matters. It really does matter how many people turn up to particular kinds of events. Secondly, these spaces can also clearly function as sites for creating particular kinds of consciousness, of a particular kind of consciousness of can-do, if that doesn't sound too self-helpy, but also in particular can-do together. The kind of intuition that probably most famously Hannah Arendt was trying to get at when she said, well, if a lot of people come together, both in terms of what they share and in their differences, emphasizing their plurality, then something can happen in between them. They can build a kind of power which is not going to be available in any other way. So that, of course, is what she famously called the space of appearance, which is not really just a physical space, but is what happens in between people if they develop this kind of consciousness. Thirdly, and I was reluctant to mention this because I don't think that you need to have people come from Princeton to lecture people at Berkeley about risks of exposing yourself. I mean, not exposing, but being in public space and risking something and perhaps having to face violent confrontations. I'm not sure I'm the person to lecture you on this, but it's an obvious point in this context that the sheer fact of going out there and putting your body at risk in a certain way shows a kind of commitment through public space that is very, very hard to show or to replicate in any other context. Fourth, public space can also serve as the site, more specifically, for prefigurative politics. You become a kind of site where individuals acting in concert do not just show commitment, or risk-taking, but more specifically, construct something which can foreshadow, if you like, a different kind of world, different forms of self-organization. That, of course, is one of the often told stories about the real meaning of Occupy. The real meaning was not that, its organizers were addressing certain demands and then these demands did or didn't get fulfilled. The real meaning, if you read theorists like David Graeber, was, of course, to say this was actual authentic anarchism. And all these things that people may have seen as secondary at the time, organizing the library, organizing a certain kind of order in terms of who could speak how and so on, was actually what truly mattered. Something similar, I think for the most part long forgotten example of something comparable that also happened in Washington D.C., something called Resurrection City, that was a kind of real city built on the mall close to the Lincoln Memorial in the late 60s. It was basically the follow-up to something that was known at the time as the Poor People's March. And the poor people who marched on Washington had permission to basically construct a little city close to the Lincoln Memorial, which then in turn served as a kind of staging ground for more specific protests in the rest of Washington, D.C. But also became a kind of showcase for saying, look how well we can organize. Don't think of us as protesters, especially African Americans, as any kind of threat around here. Look, we can do this in a very well organized kind of way that basically involves self-policing of sorts and so on. And it lasted a fairly long time, and only basically when there was huge rainfall and became very muddy and so on did the city eventually have to disappear. Now, just to kind of maybe drive home this particular point, I want to give you one, again, very well-known example of what it seems can only maybe sometimes be done in physical public space. Many of you, of course, maybe all of you will recognize this image. This was the famous standing man who appeared after the Gezi Park protests had been put down by the government in 2013. Basically, the word went out that demonstrations had to be over, couldn't do anything that looked like a political manifestation at the time. And then this man appeared out of nowhere and just stood on Taksim Square. Of course, he didn't just stand in a random position. It mattered what and who he was looking at. Of course, it mattered that he was facing the large picture of Ataturk and by implication, in a sense, relating himself to the authentic initial Republican values of Turkey. What happened next? I'm sure you remember. Other people started simply to stand there. And then more and more people just stood there for hours and hours, for hours and hours. And eventually this even spawned a kind of pop culture cottage industry of people saying this is such a potent symbol of what you can do without violating any of the new rules by the Erdogan regime. He didn't say anything, he didn't sort of hold up any signs, simply standing there, that we should propagate this particular thing. So eventually people came up with images like this, and then for the more adventurous, lots of varieties of what you could possibly do as a standing man or a standing woman, or for that matter what you could do if you were in a wheelchair. So perhaps following from this very abbreviated discussion of possible political functions of public space, I think what we can conclude is that public space needs to fulfill a couple of very, very basic requirements to do what it needs to do in terms of the dual nature of democracy. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be possible to hold it in a certain kind of way. If you think about Zuccotti Park, of course it was officially private space. Unlike many other privately owned public spaces in New York City, such as atria of big banks, it was accessible and it was possible legally to be there around the clock, but at a certain point it became possible to come up with a legal justification for why nevertheless people camping out there could be removed. So it needs to be accessible, it needs to be possible to hold it, and perhaps less obviously, ideally it shouldn't be overprogrammed. It should really, in a sense, be an open genuinely empty space, which then people themselves give certain meanings one way or the other. Now, as I said, as I promised, I want to spend a few more minutes on a question which, for obvious reasons, has become more urgent in this context, namely, how does physical public space relate to basically the online realm? One doesn't have to immediately jump to the question, will one replace the other? Although it's worth asking, because 20 years ago, people might have had a discussion about newspapers and online and said, oh, that's the wrong question to ask. And little did we know that the possibility of replacement in a certain way was to become very real. But even if you don't think that's a real possibility, it's worth reflecting on the fact that many influential political actors today have said that it's the particular dynamics between online and offline that might afford them new political possibilities and that they sometimes see in a particularly positive light. So Beppe Grillo, for instance, has gone on record as saying, non c'è web senza piazza, non c'è piazza senza web. And I think on one obvious level he is right, that the five-star movement started out by having these large rallies. It was important to have these rallies, which some of you may know had the lovely title Vaffanculo Days. And then, later on, he also said the blog is really the key to a new kind of political engagement. We can talk later on about whether he's right or not in terms of the normative promises which he thinks that holds out. So there's that, basically the idea that the dynamic is particularly important. And maybe more threateningly, for some of us at least, is the idea that, of course, by now it's become possible to design or redesign cities in a way that is fully integrated with the internet. Many of you will have heard about the innocuous sounding Sidewalk Labs, which belongs to Google, and which was basically given a piece of prime real estate in Toronto to basically develop it in a completely novel, fully basically integrated way as far as the internet is concerned. So Eric Schmidt in this context said, the genesis of the thinking for Sidewalk Labs come from Google's founders getting excited, thinking of all the things you could do if someone would just give us a city and put us in charge. We'll see what that's going to look like. But it obviously, I think, forces us to maybe think more systematically about what can only be done in physical public space, what can be done online, and what might happen between these in a certain way. So here are a couple of thoughts on this specific issue. First of all, I think it's become very obvious at this point that while in physical space there might be many barriers, and there might be, of course, legal restrictions, on at least some occasions it is possible to overcome these. There are barriers on the internet which most of us will never overcome, and maybe even the most skillful hackers cannot possibly overcome. So the kind of redeeming thought for physical space that yes, even if it's sometimes privately owned, you can still do something, I think simply doesn't apply online in quite the same way. And this has, by the way, also implications for particular political practices. So if you think of practices revolving around civil disobedience, it might very often be possible to do illegal things in physical space that are virtually impossible to replicate online. Yes, you can maybe do things like, distributed denial of service as a kind of equivalent of blocking something. But again, many of us, I think, are not in a position really to do this, and it might never last as long as something could last in physical, more or less, public space. Secondly, and this point, of course, has been made a million times, online, it's much less likely to tell a comforting story about any kind of agora where we experience the demos in its diversity, any kind of story about chance encounters where we hear about issues, about identities and interests, which otherwise we may not have heard about. So I don't want to belabor the point. Everybody knows, of course, by now about the highly segmented online public spheres, echo chambers, and so on and so forth. A more interesting question, I think, is whether online we can make this intuition about a massive presence plausible or not. On the plus side, on the positive side, you might say, well, yes, we can. Everybody in the last couple of days has been talking about how basically a high school student all of a sudden gets more than 1 million followers, and more followers than you know who. So you might say, well, that actually is sort of the equivalent of making a massive presence visible. At the same time, it's the question of, well, how much visibility does that really generate? Given that in physical public space, you really, on one level, become visible, and you, in a sense, put your body at risk in a way that is not the case online. At the same time, that might be too simplistic. Because while you make yourself visible in a certain way in physical public space, there are also plenty of ways of, as the cliched phrase would go, disappearing into the crowd. So you might not really be known out there. But online, you probably will be known. And what has sometimes, I think, rightly been described as the danger of asymmetrical visibility is much higher online than out there. Of course, out there you also might have surveillance cameras and so on, but by and large, as the famous phrase used to go, on the internet everybody knows who you are. And if you click on things like ad trackers, you basically get a sort of making visible of that intuition of, I thought I was alone, but actually 50 people are watching me. Well, not quite 50 people, but basically, I'm definitely not in any sense alone. So this, I won't belabor the point, but I think this is one of the more interesting conceptual questions to ask in this context. To the extent that we might not always equate visibility with risk-taking and democratic commitment, what is the space or place for a legitimate form of anonymity, either offline or online? So, some of you may remember there was a famous Supreme Court decision where the court actually said anonymity can be justified because under certain circumstances you want to remain anonymous because you fear the tyranny of the majority. You might have a very unpopular opinion, so it's legitimate that people don't know who authored a leaflet, where it's coming from, and so on and so forth. Obviously a very pertinent thought in the context of the last election, where now people feel, well, we wish we'd known where some stuff was coming from. So do we want to abandon that intuition about anonymity entirely, and if not, what exactly is the right place and space for it? I pose that more as a question for discussion later on, but I want to finish on something else for which I need technical help, if I may. Because one thing for sure, both, if you like, online and offline have in common, which is that whatever we more particularly want to say about the wages of visibility, intervisibility, etc., in both cases, obviously, unless we really have a situation of complete co-presence, and hence a certain kind of intervisibility, what really is always going to matter is how something is and is not framed. And I want to give you for me, particularly striking example of this that I think also particularly speaks to our political moment. And just, if you don't mind, just watch. It's not about what's being said. If you don't mind, pay attention to the dramaturgy and the it's with sound, right? Yeah, okay. And the
à l'aveuglement, à la lâcheté, à l'inertie, se substitueront la lucidité, le courage et l'action. Ne soyez ni anxieux ni abattus, soyez juste impatients. Les forces qui montent du pays sont puissantes, comme un instinct de survie. Je les crois irrésistibles. Des obstacles se dresseront devant nous encore. La bataille politique sera âpre, évidemment. Rien ne nous sera épargné, c'est une certitude. Ça a déjà commencé et je les pense capables des pires extrémités. Mais nous triompherons de tout cela. Et de ces batailles électorales naîtra une nation libre, fière, confiante, fraternelle, où il fera un nouveau bon vivre. Oui, de ce combat, la France renaîtra. À ceux, enfin, qui sont parfois saisis par le doute ou par la crainte, je rappellerai ces mots de Bernanos. L'espérance est un risque à courir. Vive la République! Vive le peuple! Et vive la France!
Okay, moment to digest. Recover, detox. If I may, 2 words of context, and then the point I was trying to get across. So this video of the youth organization of the National Front in France depicts a ritual which actually no longer exists. Every 1st of May, the National Front would lay down a wreath at the statue of Joan of Arc in the 1st arrondissement of Paris. This is the last time this ever happened, 2015. Afterwards, the leadership of the front said the danger of terrorism was too great. Instead, we will have a banquet inside. 2 things stand out immediately. One is, of course, that we never see the statue of Joan of Arc. But why would we need to? Because we have our own Joan of Arc in the present right there. Secondly, you all will have noticed that something strange happens about 2/3 through. So all of a sudden, these half-clad women appear on the balcony. And this actually did happen, and many of you will have guessed, it was a protest by Femen against this event. What you don't see here is that basically the security forces of the National Front acted with extraordinary brutality vis-a-vis these women. They pulled their hair, choked them to get them off the balcony. Anyway, the important thing for me is that the official, in a sense, record of the event doesn't deny the protest, doesn't deny that this happened. No, it very obviously tries to make the protest work for its own narrative. And since, in my view, these are sort of classic right-wing populists, it matters that right-wing populists always are going to engage in some form of culture war. And that this kind of conflict allows them precisely to say, yes, there is that essentially alien force that we can perfectly now depict as a threat. Less obviously, I think it's also pretty clear that it's not just in general, on the one hand, the real French people and then these aliens. It's also more particular, you might say, to feminisms which are opposed to each other. Because surely it's not an accident that most of the people you see on the National Front side are young women who look like all they care about is defending, good old French Republican values of liberté, égalité, and, well, the other one doesn't work so well, but you get the issue. And then there's basically this crazy, also in a certain way, Eastern feminism that is completely defeated. And the dramaturgy, of course, is that before they appear, everybody stands, then they appear, everybody moves, and then basically these aliens, in a sense, disappear. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because clearly we live in a moment when many people feel it's important, it's particularly important to go out there and protest. And it is, I'm not saying it isn't. But it's always, I think, particularly important also to think a couple of steps ahead and say, how is, if I may put it that generally, how is the other side going to respond? And how will it look like when they try to incorporate the protest into whatever particular narrative they are pushing? I don't want to go quite so far as Stephen Bannon,
remember Stephen Bannon? Who at one point said, the resistance is our friend. But of course he was onto something. He was onto basically the particular strategy of saying, yes, the more we can say that it's, bi-coastal, liberal, bleeding heart liberals who, all come out to airports, etc., the better for us, because we can show the real people who, in a sense, their enemy is. Or, one other example, if I may, some of you may recall that almost exactly a year ago, the government in Hungary threatened to shut down Central European University. About 80,000 people came out on the streets of Budapest. At the time, it was felt this really means something. These are not just spoiled students. It's elementary school teachers. It's families. It really is a very diverse group. This must mean something. What did the government say? The government said the Soros network. We didn't realize it was able to bring out quite so many people, but we were happy that we dragged them into the light. Now we know they're even more than we thought, and we have to double our efforts to fight essentially these enemies of the people. So just as a gentle and maybe entirely unnecessary and maybe all too obvious reminder that there's always a further process of framing, of coding, and in that sense, whether online or offline, there's always the need to think these couple of steps ahead beyond the immediate dramaturgy of whatever one wants to do by way of protest in an actual physical or non-physical public space. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to
There are two types of scholars, I think, out there in the world. Those who have a basically prosecutorial and polemical attitude towards the issues they deal with. They write and argue in a way that it's like a lawyer in a courtroom always trying to win a case. There are other scholars who have a more charitable attitude. They take seriously the positions of their opponents, they listen, they understand the vulnerability of their own positions, they understand basically that there is a kind of dialogic thing going on rather than a prosecutorial win-lose situation. Now, those of you who've had the experience of reading Jan-Werner Müeller's work will know that he is in the latter camp. His work is distinguished by its charity, by its openness, by its ability to take seriously positions that he may not himself hold, but which others have held and which need to be heard at their strongest. Now, this, I think, in a scholar is a great virtue, but it makes it extremely difficult for someone who is trying to give a rebuttal, because about half of the arguments I was going to make, he's already made, and he added several more that I had not seen in the original paper. So I don't really have a kind of counter-punching argument. What I have instead are footnotes, in a way, if you want to keep with the architectural metaphor, ornaments on the structure that he's given us. And I hope these will, in a way, continue the discussion rather than provide a kind of oppositional argument. First, I'd like to make a few points about the issue of transparency, the issue of visibility, the issue of the visual dimension of democracy. Now, I think he's very, very wise in bringing this to the fore, but also wise in showing us the ambiguities of the situation. Transparency, very powerful term, one of the great fetishistic terms with accountability in democracy. That we ought to have sunlight that disinfects, we ought to have availability to the eyes of the populace, what has previously been hidden, no secret deals, nothing in back rooms. The people should see, the people should have access. Very powerful democratic ideal. There is, however, I would say, complication, and his discussion, I think, brings this to the fore. Visibility can take place in several different forms. It can take place in terms of surveillance. You are being watched. You are being, in a way, in the eye of either a big brother or at least some sort of authority which may not manifest itself. The old panopticon ideal that, of course, Foucault made so famous, the notion that somehow we are transparent to those who want to see us, who want to pierce our armor, see our secrets. Now, democracy obviously, in some important way, resists this. And a good example of this, of course, is the secret ballot, which most countries have adopted. late 19th century, the idea that, no, I don't have to tell you who I voted for. No, I don't have to disclose my political beliefs. That I have a kind of cordon sanitaire around my, let's say, interiority. And that democracy requires that. So absolute surveillance becomes, in a way, totalitarian. The second model is the model of, let's call it exhibition spectacle, the model of showing, the model of being in front of everybody, the way I'm in front of you all now, the way Macron was in front of the audience at the Acropolis with the sun shining on him, almost like le roi soleil, le président soleil. The sun is shining. He doesn't have to see it. As a matter of fact, with the sun shining on his face, he probably can't see anything. So there the idea is that you are the cynosure of all eyes. You are at the center of the spectacle. And here too there is a kind of, let's say, a democratic deficit, because it's one-dimensional or at least one-directional. You're the audience, I'm talking. You're looking at me, I'm sort of glancing at you, but basically not taking in what I'm looking at. So it has a kind of asymmetrical quality. And the relationship between the spectacle and democracy is one that is highly fraught. The third relationship, and this is the one, of course, that we emphasize, is that of intervisibility, the space of appearance, a la Hannah Arendt, where we all are on an equal playing field. No one is standing up looking at the sun in his face and everybody else passively looking at him or her. There is a kind of relationship of relative equality. And this, of course, is in a way the old notion of the Hannah Arendtian agora, in which everybody gets to speak, everybody is equal. Let's not worry about the slaves and women outside, but everybody, at least in the space, is capable of participating. And this is a participatory notion of democracy, in which visibility and the ability to speak and the obligation to listen are all intertwined. And one might see this as, I think, a basic desideratum of democracy, but also one that is more absent than present. And when we got to the end of the talk, we heard about the internet, and quite clearly the internet creates a dispersed invisibility. I mean, you are to some extent visible, but you're also able to hide your tracks. You don't necessarily know who's at the other end of a discussion. There's a tremendous amount of static noise in that system. So that in a way, democracy functions in very small groups, perhaps, direct democracy with indivisibility, but in the larger modern democracies, which are mass democracies, very, very hard to attain. So this brings us to the idea of glass architecture as a kind of model of democracy, a symbol of democracy. Glass architecture, of course, is something that goes back really, basically, go back to the Crystal Palace, but it really becomes, we might say, ideologically important in the early 20th century. You get Scherbart and Bruno Taut and others stressing the importance of glass as a modern technology. Now, what's fascinating is that this could, and I think Jan-Werner is very good at pointing this out, lead, as we saw with the Casa de Fascio, in a rather disturbing direction, maybe the direction of surveillance. But glass architecture is not inherently on the side of democratic visibility. It's fascinating that Walter Benjamin was very much taken by Paul Scherbart, who wrote the great book on glass architecture in the mid-teens. But what is often forgotten is that Scherbart emphasized colored glass, not transparent glass, glass that was decorative. He was very much opposed to Adolf Loos and the idea of a kind of ornamentless architecture, in which, in the later terms that we heard before, form would follow function. He, in a way, saw the importance of the colorful variety of glass, which could in fact produce a very different effect from the effect of full transparency. Those of you interested in transparency, let me just make a little footnote here. A new book by Stefanos Geroulanos on the critique of the idea of transparency in mid-20th century French law. Very, very long and quite powerful critique of the idea of transparency, including in architecture. So one can go on about transparency. It's one of those things that can go either way, and I don't want to prejudice by saying architecture should always be somehow opaque. But what's fascinating, just as a kind of final thought on this particular issue, is that the idea of the ornamented facade, the idea of the wrapping of a building, which was seen by many as somehow deceitful, and that's what, of course, Loos wanted to do when he wanted to get rid of when he called the ornament crime, that one could construe a facade as comparable in the verbal sense to rhetoric, something that uses figures, uses ornaments of speech, as it were. And we know that democratic speech is not simply scientifically direct, pure, clear speech. It also, and perhaps even essentially, involves rhetorical interactions, metaphors. It involves all types of Ciceronian, let's say, devices. And without rhetoric, without the facade, we might say, without the ability to persuade through ornamentation rather than strict rational argument, and here I sort of say kind of pace habermas, democracy doesn't exist. I don't want to go through the argument that I tried to make in a book called The Virtues of Mendacity a few years ago, which dealt with lying in politics, but one can make a certain case for the necessity of a kind of dissembling in the political realm. But this would take us too far afield. The larger point I want to make concerns what might be called the temporality of democracy and its relation to architecture. In a way, and I think this is perhaps the most obvious way to think about it, democracy is still to come. Democracy is a process of democratization, always endangered, always future-oriented. Derrida famously said that democracy is avenir, it's in the future, it's to come. It doesn't exist yet. And Jan-Werner discussed the prefigurative quality of, say, Occupy as a kind of expression of human interaction, anarchistic, hierarchical, which anticipates the prefigurative politics of the future, democracy, which may in fact come, but is not yet here. It also seems to be crucial to think of architecture and democracy in terms not only of the future, but also of the past. That is to say, architecture has within it, we might call it memory, or at least something that is based on a moment of foundation. You remember Vitruvius's famous trichotomy of fermentatis, which means basically kind of the stability of the building, the duration of the building, utilitatis, the use the building is going to be put to, and finally, the nusitatis, its beauty. The first, though, is the durability, the endurance of the building, what we might call the foundation of the building. So the question really is, what is the relation between the foundation and democracy? And here, I think of his own work on constitutional patriotism. Democracies are not simply people making decisions in a kind of legislative way, the general will or whatever expressing itself at this moment. They're also in relation to previous moments of founding. Hannah Arendt, who's been mentioned in terms of the agora and the space of appearance, always emphasized the importance of founding, of creating a space, creating a kind of structure, creating some sort of place to which people could go and say, well, is it constitutional? Is it in accord with what the founding fathers or mothers thought should be the case? And architecture gives us some sense of the importance of founding, even in a democratic context, in which the future is so crucial, that there has to be some relation between that moment of founding and where democracy ultimately will go. And we know that this is a kind of liberal democracy, that founding, when you have a kind of constitutional check on demagogic will formation in the present, can be an important way in which democracy preserves itself against the whims of the moment. So that's one way in which at least the rhetoric of architecture makes us understand and value a moment in the past. But then the question has to be asked, well, what's beneath the foundation, if you really want to go back? One way to think about it is beneath the foundation is soil, is the earth, is something more basic than culture, something more fundamental, something natural. Now here we enter some, in a way, dicey territory, because one can argue that the soil, and one hears already Nazi notions of Blut and Boden, the soil is too ethnic. It has to do with the autochthonous people who live in a particular place. The idea of the soil of democracy is a people understood as an ethnos rather than a demos. And one could think, of course, of Carl Schmitt as someone who emphasized the importance of the homogeneity of the democratic community as the soil out of which decisions could be made. Not pluralism, not heterogeneity, not inclusion of others, not aliens who come in and become citizens, but something in a bit like soil there before we had choice almost. A little bit dangerous. Another way to think about what is before the foundation is to think about previous cultural phenomena which we usually call ruins. It's quite interesting. There's a very interesting, important book by Daniel Purdy on the metaphors of architecture in German thought, mostly philosophy, deals with Kant and Goethe. And the title of the book is On the Ruins of Babel, Tower of Babel and the Ruins. The metaphor of ruins is very interesting. You have to think basically in almost, specifically historical literal terms, that most buildings are built not on absolutely tabula rasa cleared space. They're built on the ruins of something that came before. And the attitude that we have, democratically or otherwise, towards those ruins is extremely important. We can simply destroy them, cast them into a kind of oblivion, forget about them. Or we can take them seriously and in a way honor the people who came before. So, say the Native American shell mounds, even here in Berkeley, are in a way places of the dead of previous cultures that we now at least try to honor, that we try to recognize are worthy of being taken seriously. And so democracy, as it were, reaches back behind or before foundations and pays tribute to the people who came before. One of the great, we might say, how to put this delicately, but one of the great unfortunate assumptions of Zionism was a phrase that was made famous, I think it was it Rupert, I forget who first uttered it, that basically this was a project of a people without land for a land without people. Well, it turned out the land did have people, and it did have ruins of those inhabitants and their civilization. So the gesture of wiping it away, of a land that was utterly barren and empty, was in some sense, we might say, one of the sources of what we alas see as the anti-democratic spirit that seems now to inhabit contemporary Israeli politics. You can get rid of the people before they don't matter, so that has to be kind of memory. So ruins are very crucial, and how democracy deals with the residues of the past is very, very significant. One final observation about this, though, beneath the surface may be ruins, they may be earth, they may also be something a bit more ephemeral, a bit more fluid, as it were, and we might conceptualize it in terms of water. And here I'm thinking of the great metaphor that Otto Neurath introduced. Some of you I'm sure know about it. It has to do with epistemological foundationism. He said basically that there are no foundations, Kant to the contrary notwithstanding, in epistemological terms. But basically what we're doing is building a raft as it is breaking apart on the open sea. That the raft is drifting, we're standing on solid territory and rebuilding the places that are beginning to lose their solidity. So this is an image not of a foundation, not of something like soil or even ruins, but something so fluid that we have no, in a way, security. And I like the idea of democracy being essentially the realm of the uncertain. And this captures that. Democracy tries to build foundations. It has constitutions, but you could always amend constitutions. You could always disregard constitutions. And they have soil. You could always leave behind the ethnos and move into another area. It may have ruins that you simply disregard. There is a kind of fluid quality. And this brings me to one final metaphor, and I'm thinking more in metaphorical, literal terms, and it has to do with the idea of the net or the web. And we heard a little bit about that at the end of Jan-Werner's talk. The net or the web is a very interesting architectural two metaphors in a way. The web has no center. The net has lots of holes. It extends not like a grid, which has boundaries, but rather into infinity. Webs and nets have no frames. They can go anywhere. And there's a sense of a kind of fluid-like quality. And contemporary democracy, we might say, to the extent that it is situated in that space, in the cyberspace of the net, the cyberspace of the web, is far more fragile, more, in a way, still on process. We don't exactly know where it's going, and also which covers its tracks in ways that are quite fascinating. The history of what went before is, in a way, more easily effaced. So that imperative, which I was trying to argue for a moment ago, being in touch with where we came from, honoring the shell mounds that we're destroying as we build our new modern cities, the web and the net moves away from that. And it is one of the great, we might say, dangers of the web that it may undercut the possibility of democracy in the future because of that. And here we get one final point, which is one that Frederick Jameson made many years ago when he talked about postmodern architecture. It's interesting that we heard no distinction, modern, postmodern. That seems to have gone by the board. But Jameson pointed out that the nodal points of the modern city were basically, in a way, urban. They were within a kind of frame. They were local, more or less. I mean, there are railroads and so forth that create a larger net. The postmodern city is a city based on airports, based on terminals that are internationally or post-nationally located. The flow of money, where are bitcoins? All of this is now, in a way, so displaced that the idea of a space, the idea of a local space, the idea of a space where we can gather and see one another through intervisibility has now been utterly and completely undercut by the way in which the postmodern world, or the contemporary world, has created these networks which are underneath the radar, going much faster than you can see, and destroying any possibility of community. So let me stop there and give the floor back to Jan-Werner.
Just one thing in response that maybe is worth saying. I think ideally if one engages in reflections about democracy and architecture together, it doesn't come out as a kind of mechanical application of democratic ideas to architecture and the built environment. You know, we have this, now where do we find it, and so on. But instead becomes a more circular process where maybe looking at them together yields insights which one simply wouldn't have if one looked at them just always separately. So one thing that occurred to me in this context, also now hearing Martin's comments, is that maybe all along it was a mistake to think of transparency in and of itself as somehow a democratic value, and that maybe actually looking at architecture and the built environment sort of brings this out more clearly, and that those who sort of think they can play it as a sort of obvious trump card of, you know, things must always be transparent, tacitly rely on related ideas, but kind of run different things together so that at least initially it kind of sounds plausible, but actually ultimately isn't. What I mean is that I think what certain transparency talk relies on is basically a very simple notion of rule of law style predictability. You want to know what certain procedures are, you want to understand democracy by way of, okay, this is sort of roughly how this works, both at the highest constitutional level, but also at the level of other procedures, so that you can orient yourself in terms of your own conduct around these procedures. So it would be a perfectly legitimate thing to say, next time the Democratic Party in this country chooses a presidential candidate, I would like to be aware of how exactly the procedures are working, so that I can strategically, for instance, vote very early on for somebody to make sure they get into the debate at the earliest moment, to make their views known, and so on and so forth. But that's not really the same as transparency as we talk about it in other contexts. And I think what transparency talk often kind of tends to imply is an almost sort of technocratic vision, where basically we say, if we all really saw this together, we would converge on the judgment. There wouldn't be any need anymore for any kind of pluralistic debate around what something means, because the meaning is sort of there as soon as we see it. And of course, many aspects of politics are not like that. And it kind of, it's an accident that Macron was there, but he is somebody who might engage in that kind of rhetoric of saying, we are now particularly transparent and so on. But transparency doesn't get rid of deep disagreements in a democracy, and that's not a problem, because democracy is there to accommodate deep disagreements. So I think there's a difference between saying these procedures have to be basically clearly understandable, it has to be predictable in a certain way, but many aspects of the process as such can be non-transparent, and clearly in empirical terms, all efforts to make the process more transparent have only ever produced new realms of invisibility. So the more you say, now the light will shine on this part, of course, politicians will find another way to recede to yet another, metaphorically or even practically, back room where the real stuff happens. And I think that's virtually unavoidable, but it's also not as big a problem as maybe sometimes makes it out to be, if one thinks that transparency is a value that clearly has no contrasting or contending values, and that if in doubt has to trump everything else. So this might be an instance where this kind of reflection helps us to kind of test some of our own intuitions about democracy and realize, okay, maybe sometimes our expectations are somewhat misplaced. And so I like this idea of saying that there can be perfectly legitimate forms of basically non-transparency, which at the same time also actually have genuine cognitive value, in the sense that the decoration/rhetoric is not just some add-on that if you strip it away, then we're going to see the real thing, but actually can carry in itself judgments and arguments and allow people to relate to politics in a more meaningful way, as opposed to, the more is visible, the more I can relate to it.
In some ways, I hate to say it, but I think we're so far beyond both of these concepts, visibility and, one might say, audibility, that it's almost impossible to talk about them in any organized way, except at the metaphoric level.
So one thing I would say in response, which might not really be an answer to the question, no question anyway, other than this, absolutely relevant now, is to say that, again, coming back more specifically to protests, if you look today at sort of classic models of disobedience, civil disobedience, which many people have been revisiting in the last few months or so, they say, or let's say Rawls or Habermas put on the table, I think still is sort of normatively the right answer, is as relevant as it was, when they wrote it. But they always came with an assumption that you could, in some not too mediated way, basically make certain injustices visible to a majority of your compatriots. And that there was some relatively uncomplicated way of doing it. And this assumption, of course, can no longer be taken for granted. So I think a lot of us still have this deep down, I can't really speak for you, but that's fine. Deep down have this sort of wishful thinking that it just takes, to allude to a famous Danish fairy tale, it just takes one child to say that the emperor is naked, and then the show is really over. But of course, the fairy tale is premised on the idea that everybody can hear the child. And in a world of highly segmented media spheres, lots of people have completely different things. Although, actually, come to think of it, that's actually really an interesting point in relation to what you said about gossip. If I remember correctly, strictly speaking, not everybody hears the child. The parent hears the child and then whispers, and then it goes around basically. Everybody basically trusts the other person to speak the truth and say, yes, now that you mentioned it, of course, right? So it's not quite the same as everybody can see it or everybody can hear it. Well, everybody can see it, but not everybody can hear it. But there's a kind of basic form of trusted intermediation, so that, if your whatever friends and relatives say, look, what just happened politically is a scandal, you kind of say, yes, I take that to be a valid judgment, and that can inform my judgment in turn. Which maybe, I don't want to make too much of this, I'm not sure we can sort of build our bold strategies today on Danish fairy tales, but in a sense might be a suggestion that sometimes you just have to go around established media structures and say, okay, if I go up against Sean Hannity, it's not going to go very far. If I build my own networks of having trusted people who say certain things, occasionally involving people who are not always already on the same page politically, maybe that's a thought worth entertaining.
Yes.
I'll do my best to be coherent here. Thank you very much to both of you for the lovely talk and the ornamentation that followed. This isn't really a question, rather an add-on. I was fortunate enough to have had a conversation with a colleague and friend and comrade, I'll add as well, regarding the use of glass in architecture and transparency as both symbolic and metaphoric, and as well as the concern with protests in public space. And one of the conclusions that we came to in talking was that while glass does bring forth transparency, it also has its own invisibility to it. It hides itself for what it is, a barrier And in this case, we were discussing how is it that something becomes visible, and how would a separation or a barrier in this case become visible. And one of the conclusions that we got to based on his fieldwork following anarchist movements in Serbia was that it is precisely a brick being thrown into the window that renders it visible. Otherwise, it's hiding, you see right through it, and suddenly what is a barrier can be seen in plain sight through the large cracks that form in it. This is one comment on that. And just a kind of related follow-up, the idea of disappearing into the crowd and so forth, this moving between visibility, having your body in public space, and then disappearing and becoming anonymous. I'd just like to link this in with any kind of discussion on what are generally called black bloc tactics, where it's precisely someone's activities where they make themselves anonymous through joining a collective that then becomes visible. So their individuality becomes hidden at this point, while a new collective emerges through common activity in a public place. Thank you.
Maybe we can gather a few.
Sure, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so perhaps continuing on the topic of transparency and these sorts of separated in and out groups and how people get their information from what they consider the in-group and out-group. It gets so bad that even the United States Senate or the Senate lunch cafeteria is a place where people basically see and unsee members of the opposite party all the time. And so my question is, or sort of what I would seek your consideration on, is sometimes when we talk about architecture, we have this perspective, the field of dreams perspective. If you build it, they will come. If you just build the right building, if you just build the right, discussion chamber, people will go at it. Is there perhaps, or can we consider perhaps a way of looking at architecture such that the actual process of seeing and unseeing people who are not in or out of your group can be subverted, so that this important aspect of democracy, the sort of meeting people who are different from you and persuading them with rhetoric and with conversation, can actually occur again?
Yes, I would like to change transparency topic into Agora and forum differences, just to finish with a question. I'm very, very close to your positions because at the beginning the Agora appears because the talk appeared between people. It was like in the mythos of Troy, when Heracles put the circle on the sand before the wars of the Agora is now because they are talking. And then in the opposite, you mentioned the Bulleterium, when the Romans take the Bulleterium and put symbols and law, appear the forum. So when you go inside the forum, you are said how to act, how to make the things done, is the difference. So these frames you mentioned, because Romans, when they started to create a city, to be the foundations, where they put some soil from Rome into this new land, put the walls, so they create a frame, and there appear a different comprehension of the world that is our heritage in public space. Now it's like translated into contemporary examples. Tiananmen in China could be like huge. It's transparency maybe or not, but with the cameras, access, policemen in some points, you are not allowed to be there. So it's kind of an extreme forum nowadays. But I love the jump into the net, the internet, because to me as an architect it's important that Agora nowadays could be said to be websites, or when you talk, when it appears that you are connected, you are not off, you are on in the net. But when you mix both, I mean augmented reality, which is where goes my question, is to architecture, when assume that virtuality mixed with reality, is how citizens could access to content, because you put in the future, in the walls or in the bus station, wherever you access to some apps in your website, or you have to sing in, or you have to pay. So in the future, from your point of view, which would be the niche of or where architects can act? Because to access to these things could be a law, a frame into the internet, not into this liquidity. So there will be more two steps behind to see, okay, how citizens could react to each other in this accessibility to content. As an architect, what's your point of view? Thank you so much.
Can I get back to you in a couple of years? So, first of all, thank you all for the comments and questions. Great point about the shattering of the glass. I think it's absolutely right that that's one other aspect which the kind of facile transparency ideology stuff just kind of leaves out entirely as an issue. On the other question of anonymity, well, I think that's sort of where I think a wider normative discussion might be necessary, and I think it partly will revolve around questions of connecting disobedience to personal investment and accountability. So there are now theorists of civil disobedience who would say, no, we always overrated that. It's, the importance of these practices is not that you're willing to go to jail because you identify yourself, and therefore, basically you show how serious you are by taking the punishment. And that's particular. A couple of French theorists have said, look, it's the wrong question to ask, should Snowden be punished or not, and so on. It's really just about the revelation, the injustice, whatever you want to kind of make visible, if you like, and everything else is secondary. And there's no, there's no normative cost to anonymity, or, to put it more pointedly, not standing by your actions in a certain kind of way. I think that might be a bit too quick, because I think both the actual power of these kinds of acts derives from a certain kind of ethical investment. And if nothing else, it kind of increases the barrier before people do this. We always think that civil disobedience is done by good people, and it's got to further justice, and then usually some totally sanitized historical account of the civil rights movement comes in, and etc. But of course, it can be done by anybody. And there's Charles Murray has written a book about civil disobedience, saying that federal government has become so bad that if you are a conservative, you actually have to start thinking about how to cease cooperation, and so on. So therefore, I think that's another consideration, that just practically, in still, let's say, halfway functioning democracies, it doesn't seem to me to be wrong to have an intuition that law breaking doesn't become a sort of almost potentially costless kind of conduct to engage in. You're absolutely right that it's behind a lot of these sort of reflections is a maybe misplaced, might even say determinism, that basically the spaces are really so powerful that they can bring about certain forms of certain practices, and clearly in many cases this is simply not true, and not for obvious reasons why things aren't happening. So I don't have forgive me, I don't have a kind of magic answer as to this is how you would really sort of bring people ideally together, except that one can easily think of various barriers why it wouldn't happen in certain situations, and one can to some degree maybe get rid of these barriers. But given the invisible barriers to do with certain, let's say, mentalities or sense that, this isn't our kind of place, or I wouldn't go there, that's of course much more difficult in many ways. And I feel I don't have a kind of this. If you only had this kind of space, it would be different sort of answer. The only thing I would say is that, of course, it can sometimes take a long time before something is appropriated in a way that isn't predictable. So just think of the kind of cliched invocations of Brasilia for a long time. People said, this is this typical Corbusier-style modernist, utopia, totally sterile in practice, absolutely doesn't function like it was supposed to function. And then in 2013, these striking images, and people literally sort of take possession of the building and climb on the roofs and kind of, use them for something that, whether you agree with the agenda that they have or not, I think is justifiably characterized as a kind of democratic practice. As in, I'm still trying to say something about I didn't mean to be too flip. I mean, I really don't have an answer. Okay, forgive me, but I think the maybe not entirely trivial thought in this context would be to say, especially against the sort of utopian visions of sidewalk labs and so on, is that surely there must be, especially given this worry about asymmetrical visibility, surely there must be a choice for you as a citizen whether you want to be visible or not under certain conditions. And if basically you are no longer able to in a very minimal way function in certain spaces and places without, in a sense, rendering yourself visible, then I think something has gone wrong. And I don't know how architects would do that, how they would kind of build something integrated in such a way that you clearly have a choice as to whether you want to, quite apart from anything political, stay anonymous or feel compelled to make yourself visible in a certain manner.
I want to ask a little bit more about this opposition, I guess, that is implied, or maybe you even explicitly say this elsewhere, between democracy and populism. It's this, right-wing populism, I guess. It strikes me that, especially with something like accessibility in architecture, it's strange to push for democracy as sort of the goal that represents justice, I don't know, or a just outcome, let's say justice or equality, or, it doesn't have to be communism, but something that kind of reflects a value rather than the decision-making structure that everyone contributes. And it seems like it's the concept of sort of liberal democracy that is partially responsible for populism, right? Because it gives people this impression that it's up to them to decide what sort of rights people should have and what sort of resources, for example, society should expend on making all spaces accessible, or giving people rights or whatever, how much welfare is enough. Of the idea of Israel-Palestine as being an interesting example of this is also, I thought maybe even it was a little understated the extent to which the very idea that Israel is a democracy is sort of premised on the idea that it's okay for some people not to have rights while everyone else in the designated area of privilege has rights. And when people talk about the demographic threat to Israel, what they're talking about is that they can't incorporate everyone that's in the West Bank as a full citizen of Israel and still play democracy. And so my idea, I guess, in response to this, or my question, is why, I guess, is the mechanism of democracy sufficient to guarantee minority rights? And this is a question you could always ask, but why this opposition, and how is it not actually a much more difficult case to make that instead of saying, oh, we are a society that values this, and so it simply goes without saying that the government should provide as much as possible for, let's say, people who are disabled. Instead, if you frame it in this democratic way, it becomes, well, we have to convince now every single person, or if it's occupied literally, you have to convince every single person because it's consensus-based. Sorry, I don't mean to ramble. I thought the Black Bloc was an interesting example because they precisely organized in order to do not illegal things like assault people. I'm not a non-supporter of them. I'm just pointing out that that's not democratic behavior, and if we think that's good, then maybe democracy is not the highest kind of ideal. So I'm wondering why it is that this is the especially with regard to something like accessibility, that's the sort of ideal, or the veneer that we're envisioning.
Directly to this? No,
I don't think so. Yeah.
Well then, would you like to respond?
Yes, and I'm glad I don't have 3 hours to respond. So, very, very crudely, but hopefully not meaningless. It's very often said today, it's sort of, becomes an avenue for certain, I think, ultimately anti-democratic cliches to come back to say that, oh yes, around the world we now basically have these majoritarian democracies that do nasty things to various minorities. That shows again how dangerous democracy basically is as an idea, because we get these And that's also usually then slipped in, irrational masses bringing charismatic leaders to power, and so on and so forth. But if you take seriously this notion of democracy as on one level being about institutionalized uncertainty, then it must also mean that, well, in theory, anybody could come to power, and no majority can cut off the possibility of future different majorities forming. And if you basically think of it as an ongoing process into the future, then anybody who closes off that process conclusively, I think, is doing something that's highly problematic. And in particular, in my understanding, populists then tend to be those actors who essentially argue we and only we represent the people, so do not really recognize the legitimacy of an opposition, and hence bring about a certain kind of closure of the democratic process. So that, I think, is how one could justify, I think, some different view of why democracy might be good. We all know how flawed it has been in the past. We all know how flawed, well, maybe not all know, maybe that we still have huge blind spots of things that only 100 years people would say, and they still didn't understand that there was another huge injustice here, so and so on. So, in that sense, it's always, as Martin was saying, it's always a process of democratization at the same time. But it has to be kept an open process, and it cannot be closed off with certain kinds of arguments. But at the same time, it also is premised on legitimate disagreements. So therefore, I think it's problematic to say that consensus is in and of itself. It's almost like transparency. It's not in and of itself a democratic value, very debated. As opposed to saying democracy enables us to live with our differences as long as we recognize the other side as prima facie. So far, so nice. So far, so much to the extent of wisdom. The difficulty is, of course, with anybody who really radically wants to exclude parts of the demos. And then democratic theory has a massive problem, because most, I think, theorists are willing to concede that it's virtually impossible to justify the composition of the demos democratically. So if you then say, let the people decide who's part of the people, obviously you get into infinite regress. And more interestingly, it becomes an issue when certain populists basically say, we tell you who belongs and who doesn't really belong. And from their point of view, they have a kind of moral story about who really belongs and who doesn't. It has to do with desert maybe, or history, or something that can look like a moral argument. And if then the response by, in the broader sense, liberal actors is simply, well, but these people have passports too, well, they legally belong, you cannot just exclude them. That sort of seems like a crudely empirical answer to what ultimately is a kind of moral position, not one I would share, but there is something there that goes beyond sort of a pure broad assertion of fact. So I don't think democratic theory is going to have that answer, but one has to then sort of think around it and come up with something else that at least can engage on that level of morality.
Thank you all for coming.